In the dead of night at sea, when the crew feels watched by an unknown presence, what mysterious entity is lurking in the darkness? Will they make it through this chilling journey safely? Are you ready to delve into the darkest corners of the unknown? Subscribe now for a chilling journey. One theory I've heard my friends say is that it's a future version of me pulling a prank on past version of me, because honestly, if or when time travel is real, I would totally screw with my younger self like that anyway. That's my story, and it's something that will always stick with me. That feeling of running away like that in the dark is something that will never leave me. It is something that I often still talk about with all of my friends. So I was on an ocean crossing from San Pedro, California, to Pitcairn on a 60T sloop. We left in early July. It was 500 miles, and it was me first mate, another crew, and a first-time captain. I was the head of night watchman, along with the other crewmen. It was the night of day 12 as well, and we were like 1,000+ nautical miles from any land, and there were no ships on the AIS for hundreds of miles. It was around 3:00 in the morning, 2 hours before my shift was done, and we had a policy of only using red light in the cockpit at night to save our night vision in case we need to go forward and fix something. I was looking at the nav when I felt something watching me from the aft of the ship. There's not a lot of interaction with anything other than the crew out there, so you know when there's another presence almost happens a lot when there's whales or dolphins. Too hard to explain, but if you know anyway. The ship had a swim step on the stern and a 2-foot tall transom. Until you got into the actual cockpit. I looked back at the stern, and crouching on the swim step, so only its forehead, eyes and hands were visible, was a blackish-grey thing. Whatever it was bold and looked shiny, and it was staring intently directly at me with beady eyes, reflecting the red light. You to the cockpit. I completely froze, and after meeting its gaze for a few moments, stared directly ahead of the nav. A moment later I heard a splash which made me look back, and when I did it was gone. The crewman with me didn't see it, and I didn't say anything about it for a couple of days. Then at dinner one evening, the captain told us of something that he had seen in the early hours of the morning ring that day. And then at dinner one evening, the captain told us of something that he had seen in the early hours of the morning ring that day, a dark slender thing treading water next to the ship, lazily bobbing there, but never taking its eyes off of the captain. I then relayed my story to him and the crewman, and we just couldn't come up with an explanation. We didn't see anything else for the rest of the trip, but we all did get that sense that we were being watched when we were alone on the deck. So sane mermaid sea demon. I have no idea. I live in the CLTH Mountains in eastern Oregon, about 20 miles from the California border. Growing up, I spent a lot of time outside, camping, hunting, fishing, etc. Well, few months ago, I had a strange experience on a family trip to our cabin near Crater Lake, and I wanted to see if anybody else could help me maybe find more info on what I saw. So I was by myself, bird watching in a small pond in the woods, maybe half a mile from the cabin. In the late afternoon, I was sitting on a big log with binoculars. I wasn't in a blind or anything, but I picked a spot where I thought I'd be less visible to any animals. After about an hour, I hadn't seen much, except a few common ducks, and it didn't seem like many animals were very active, so I was thinking about leaving. This was maybe about an hour before sunset, I think, but then I saw something moving the trees across the pond, probably 100 feet away. It was just a flash between trees, and I didn't really get any kind of good look at it. But I kept watching the spot, and after maybe 5 minutes I saw something dart from one tree to another. It was bigger than most any local bird except maybe a heron, and moved very fast without making any noise. But I still didn't really know what I was looking at. This happened again a few minutes later, and then again a few minutes after that. Each time it seemed to be moving closer as well to the pond, that is, I don't think it knew that I was there, but it was staying in incredibly well hidden, and only revealed itself for a split second at a time. At this point I'm thinking maybe it's a kit fox, or a pine marten, because of how fast and silently it moved, but I still hadn't got a good look at it, any part of it in any detail. Yet it moved between trees a few more times, until it was behind a big dead tree right on the shore. I was staying as still and silent as possible, but still worried that it would see or more likely smell me and I would spook it. But after a few more minutes, I saw something move at the edge of the water. A little arm and hand that looked just like a human's reached out and touched the mud, and then the head and the other arm came into view as it leaned out to drink from the water. I could only see the head and the shoulders and arms from where I was, but they looked so much like a person, except it was way too small and covered in what looked like, I don't know, like grayish-brown fur. The face wasn't exactly human either, more monkey-like, but it was too far away to see much detail. I decided to lift my binoculars to get a closer look, but as soon as I moved, it looked up and then disappeared back behind the tree again. I watched until it started to get dark, but I didn't see it again, not even darting behind the trees. I went back to the cabin and I told my grandpa what I saw. He's been a rancher in this area his whole life, and he said sounds like you ran into a hide behind and just laughed. I said, no, Grandpa, seriously, this isn't a joke. He said that he'd heard stories about Bigfoot and hide behind, and several times saw little human footprints on hunting trips deep in the mountains where really no children would be. What I mean is that I think he believed me, but he really didn't know much. I asked my dad and brothers, but they just started giving me a hard time about squatching. I went back to the pond the next day and walked around to where the creature had been, but I didn't find any tracks, or scat or fur or anything. I did figure that it had to be probably about 3 and 1, 2 or 4 feet tall, based on the trees that I'd seen it near, but narrow enough to hide completely behind a pine, which makes me think that it must have been standing and moving upright. And really that's it. I wish I'd seen more of it, but that face and hands were absolutely not like any local animal. It looked very much like a monkey, or a very little human. I've tried to find more info, but the only crypt people seriously talk about in this area is Bigfoot. The hide behind seems to be like a joke. Around here, there may be little people or humanoids in some of the local Native American folklore, but not a lot of detail that I could find. Anyway, I really do hope someone here has some idea as to what I might have seen. It was a very unique and memorable experience, and any further information would be appreciated very much. My name is Anastasia, and a few days ago something happened that whenever I think about it makes me feel sick. You see, we moved to an East Coast town about maybe a year ago to be closer to family. So close in fact that my aunt, my wife and my cousins are only 10 minutes walk from my house. Granted, we are very spaced out and borderline rural, despite living about 15 minutes from the outskirts of a big city. But in any case, I was walking my 2 little hounds back home from my aunt's house. My mom hates it when I'm alone the majority of the day, so I spent time at their house and I was genuinely enjoying my time. It was cold and quiet, but oddly beautiful. That day I got home, fed my pups and 2 birds and FaceTimed a friend. I was talking with them, and doing chores, and was admittedly being loud and giggly when taking out the trash to the cans on the side of my house. I get back inside and lay down in bed still chatting when my bird starts calling out at something. Now, anyone who has owned a parrot knows that they have a distinct noise for certain moments. She's been in my family for like 76 years, and with me my whole life, so I knew the sound was alarm more intrigue. I brush it off, as her seeing herself in the window reflection, and go back to talking to my friend. I get up to get some water and my back is to the sliding glass door, thankfully locked. When my friend has the wind knocked out of him, I'm confused and think that he's hurt, and he tells me go back to your room. Now I initially scoff, but then I see it in my camera view. There is a man with his face and hands pressed up against the glass door. He's a middle-aged white guy in a grey pullover and dark pants, and with a grin on his face. My friend, ever the best in panic situation, tells me don't look at him, just go to your room. I was shaking so hard I'm blubbering and decide to lock me and my dogs in my closet. My parrot is still going crazy. Mind you, English isn't my first language and it's bad when I'm shocked. So I revert back to my native language, which he doesn't know. Luckily, my friend knows to take charge, and he tells me that he'll be over in 10, and he calls the police. I'm thinking that I can run to my mom's room and find the gun. So if the guy comes into the house, I can blow a quarter-sized hole in his chest if I need to. I'm debating getting up when I hear tapping on my window. It's slow and intentionally creepy, and my stupid dog starts barking. I'm ready to accept my death at this point. I'm a teenage girl, home alone, and I am about to die. It seems, but wait, my aunt should about to be leaving for work at this point. I shoot her a quick text telling her that there's a man at our place. The tapping has stopped and I then think it's over when I realize something that makes my heart fall into my stomach. I left the front door unlocked when I took out the trash. This keeps getting worse and I beg my friend to hurry. The tapping thankfully returns to my window, and I can only close my eyes and hope that someone gets here quickly. It felt like such a long time crying to another teen who's breaking multiple traffic laws, and never before have I been so grateful to hear another man's voice yelling outside of my house at 1 in the morning. It was my scent neighbor. Apparently his pregnant wife was having bad nausea, and went out on the deck, and where it's situated you can see my whole backyard. She got a bad feeling after seeing the unfamiliar man approach my door, and woke her husband up to check it out, and honestly I thank God every day for that woman, because I think she may have actually saved me. I let my neighbors into my house, and my aunt comes about 4 minutes later packing major heat. My friend was not long after her. I went from home alone to an impromptu house party of concerned people. The police get there like 10 minutes later, and they didn't just take 30 minutes to arrive to the scene either, which is not normal right on the brighter side. My bird wasn't too alerted by this encounter, and went back to eating not 5 minutes later, and my dogs were just as happy to see all the people as I was. My friend has been staying the nights with me since then. I'm honestly finding it hard to be home alone at this point, despite the fact that an arrest was actually made. I'm thankful that my neighbor had such good instincts and that my aunt and friend were so quick on their feet, because honestly, this could have been just so much worse. My great-grandfather homesteaded in Alaska before all the housing developments and heavy traffic came in. Used to be a really quiet area, very swampy, super cold in winter. You'd walk through the swamp and hit patches not quite frozen all the way through, even in the deepest part of winter. Now, obviously, that in and of itself isn't unusual. Running water doesn't always freeze. It's a geological active area too, like. There's reasons for that. However, my great-grandfather spent time in Ireland before settling in Alaska, and he liked to tell how, when he was there, he rescued a pair of fairies and made a pact with them. In exchange for being able to see things nobody else could. He'd apparently take them with him and provide alcohol to their liking. When he settled in the homestead, he liked to tell this story that he brought the fairies with him, and so long as they had a drop of alcohol and good company in the cold winter there, they would stay. Now we did see something on occasion at the swamp, not just as kids too, but even as adults. They look like fireflies or a ball of light, mostly in white, but you'd see one in red or blue now and again. Not like slightly red or slightly blue, like red M&M or blue M&M sort of color, but glowing type of red or blue. We also saw them inside the cab a couple of times. Sometimes they would follow you or collect nearby while we were chopping firewood, but not always the red one was almost always around. When someone got hurt, though we were all fairly convinced that it made bad things happen. I'm not sure if people outside of our family saw them, but I do know everyone within my immediate family had at least a handful of direct experiences with them, and at least one negative experience with the red light or fairy, as my family's always called it. The cabin had a sort of lodge-style design. I suppose the rooms were lofted into either side of the living room, kind of like in hotels where there's an open middle section, banisters surrounded it with rooms on opposite sides. And while none of that really matters all that much, except that from upstairs you could see either side of the wall dividing the kitchen and the sunroom, and on more than one occasion you would see these little balls of light hit the wall and just keep going out the other side. You would also hear whistling, sometimes kind of an echo of what my great-grandfather sounded like when he was drinking and, as he liked to say, chatting with the fairies in his putter room. It would happen when you were in the swamp as well and in the house, and when you were the only one on the property at all. The homestead burned down shortly after my great-grandfather passed away, maybe 7 years ago, and so far nobody is in a hurry to rebuild there. I do wonder sometimes, though, if the lights are still out there or the whistling, but I'm really not in any rush to go and find out, mainly because I don't know, something tells me that they are not fairies. This happened last night, and I'm still pretty freaked out about it. We are up at my father-in-law's for Christmas. He lives in South Jersey in a pretty remote area, just north of Bern State Forest. It's quiet and always a little eerie, but felt especially weird with the overcast weather and unseasonable warmth of the last few days. We did Christmas dinner at my brother-in-law's and got back pretty late because of the radiator heat and outside temps. We slept with the window open that night. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and as I was drifting back to sleep, I heard a low wail building in volume for a few seconds before stopping abruptly. I figured that it was just an odd-sounding bird and tried to go back to sleep. It happened twice more over the course of about 5 minutes, though I was basically able to put it out of my head and start drifting back to sleep. When I heard a loud shrill blast like a too-high elephant's trumpet at this point, I shot up, heart racing. I knew that I had to close the window, and it took a bit to build up to it. When I dragged myself out of bed, I peeked through the shutters before I reached to shut. The pain and whatever it was had tripped a motion sense of light at the back of the property, and was now half illuminated, standing maybe 100 feet from the back door right at the tree line. It was cloaked, with its head partially shrouded. The bottom of its face looked flat and round, like the back of a dinner plate with another smaller half-uncovered black circle at its center. It was humanoid, and that was enough for me. I immediately slammed the window shut, and it didn't move. Just stood there with its face tilted towards the window. I shut the blinds and crept back into bed and basically hid until the sun came up. I didn't hear any more sounds. After that, I dared another look out of the window after dawn, and the figure was now gone. I managed to drift back to sleep for a few hours after that too. So has anyone seen anything like this or know what it might be? I'm frantically Googling, but nothing is really coming up. I would have been about, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 years old at this time. I wasn't in school yet, but I wasn't using diapers anymore, just underwear. We lived in Arizona, though in the early 80s I had my own room and my parents were in the room next to mine. It would get hot as well, so I just slept in my underwear on my stomach. My family was friends with our neighbor, who lived in the apartment next to our. I remember. He was a pretty cool guy who was always super nice to me and gave me candy. And one time, he was working in the attic and the wood was so bad up there that he actually fell through into our apartment once. It was a complete mess, and now my dad, like other people in the 80s, was into drinking and doing drugs. He was always good to me, but he did like to go out with the fellas and party from time to time. Our neighbor also liked to party, so they would usually go out together and come back late at night, and it seems my dad could handle partying a little and not going overboard. But as for our family friend, he was very much not like that. Now I don't know the exact story, but there were 2 rumors how he died. One was that he ended his own life from his drug addiction, and the other that he was actually murdered for a drug deal and made to look like you. He killed himself, by the way. He was found dead near a native reservation hanging by a palm tree. Being so young, I really didn't understand what death was at the time. My family and I went to the funeral, viewing, though, and the burial the next week. We visited his grave and I was really confused as to why my candy buddy wasn't around anymore. So I asked my parents where he was. They told me that he was deep in the ground near his headstone. Being a child, I started hopping up and down on his grave, yelling his name and asking if he was down there. And well, my mom didn't like that very much and told me to stop. So I did. Now that night was just normal and then it was time for bed, so I'm in my underwear falling asleep on my stomach, and it felt like I was right about to fall asleep. When I heard our family friend whisper my name, I jolted up and looked around, but there was nothing. There were no other voices and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I did run into my parents' room, though, and I told them what happened, and after that I slept with them that night. I never again did sleep on my stomach in my underwear. After that I always have to have a sheet or blanket on. Now I never heard the voice again, but I do distinctly remember hearing his voice that night. I knew that it was his voice and I knew that I heard something also. I never did jump on anyone's grave ever again. After that. It was February 22nd. I was taking a bus home, like I usually do, hung out with my friends after school, so it was like 7:00 p.m. and dark. I was the only one on the bus until this guy, if I had to guess, in his 30s or 40s, gets on at one of the stops. He looked kind of sketchy, so I didn't look at him much, but he kind of looked like Eminem, I suppose. Anyway, the bus driver stops and is taking a break for something I don't know, but he says that he can't have us stay on the bus while he's gone. So the sketchy guy gets up grumbling and swearing to himself about how it's so cold and whatnot. We all get off, though, and the sketchy guy and the bus driver go to the Circle K that we are stopped by, and I don't want to stand in the dark by myself, so I follow them. Thing is, though, by the time that I go over there, sketchy guy is coming back out already. I'm trying to avoid all eye contact and not get in the way of this guy, but he stops me and starts saying things like, "Look at, you're not even dressed for the weather. How old are you? Shouldn't be out like this." He then offers me his jacket, which I politely decline, and then starts offering to buy me hot chocolate. I'm getting pretty uncomfortable at this point, so I just say yes and going with him. He buys the hot chocolate for me and I say thanks. And he just starts ranting about how the bus driver is a terrible person for kicking us off, etc. I'm kind of tuning him out until he says if that bus driver leaves without us, I'll chase him to the next stop and put a bullet between his eyes. I was like, wow, okay, what am I even supposed to say to that? He starts making more death threats to the bus driver till he drops the bombshell and says I've done it before. You know, I've killed a man before. I'm just walking there trying to think of a response to a literal murder confession. The only thing that I could think of at the time was, did he deserve it? And he says, oh yeah, he did, and then just doesn't talk to me for the rest of the bus ride. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with that information. I looked for mug shots from murderers in my AA area, and there was nothing that looked like him. So should I tip the police or something? Let them know that, hey, there's a murderer running loose and presumably hasn't been caught yet. I'm pretty freaked out by all of this. I'm not sure if he was trying to scam me or what, but all advice would be really helpful. I'll preface this by saying that we were 12, 13 at the time, and my friend and I often snuck out of either of our houses during sleepovers for late-night walks. This was the basis of this terrifying encounter as well, and it stopped us from ever sneaking out after dark again. My friend lived opposite a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice to sneak out for us to roam around at night, because the forest was more scary and thrilling, I guess. And we always took flashlights, food and blank, so we could camp out for a couple of hours before going back home again. Well, on this fateful night, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake. So when my friend suddenly jolted me from sleep, it was past 3:00 a.m., which was a lot later than we usually snuck out. We grabbed our essentials and creeped out of the back door into the cold and dark night. Frost crunched underfoot as we crossed the deserted road, and as we reached the entrance to the forest, we noticed how pitch black it was and completely silent too. Unnervingly so, in fact. We turned on our torches, stepped into the uneven path into the forest, the light illuminating the tree swaying in the icy wind. We stepped on fallen sod leaves and bark as we made an unsteady but familiar way into our favorite part of the forest. Our cold breath, the only noise to invade the deafening silence. But we reached the small hut that we constructed one afternoon, made entirely of sticks, purely for the purpose of having some shelter for our campouts. There were times that vandals or other kids damaged our hut, but for the most part it stayed intact, but on this occasion it was completely destroyed, almost like a harbinger of what was to come. We were just deciding to just call it a night, and come back later, on that day, to repair the hut. When we heard it, the loud shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck instantly stand up. My friend and I jumped in shock and looked at each other like what the heck was that. We were completely freaked out. The eerie and unnatural giggle rang out again, contradicting the silence and making my body break out in goosebumps. "Someone's here," my friend whispered to me, looking utterly terrified. "We have to go now." Her voice of rationale made it even more scary and unnerving to me that someone was in the forest with us at 3:00 in the morning. We just looked at each other in assent and took off running in unison, our footsteps navigating the path as naturally as we could from muscle memory, our uneven gasps of air punctuating the giggling that seemed to be following us, now getting closer and closer. Our torches' light went up and down with our fast movements, illuminating random patches of trees and bushes. As we finally saw a small sliver of light, as we came to the forest entrance running out of the forest. We didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and almost collapsed in a breathless heap of relief to be safe. Then my friend's eyes went wide, and she nudged me, pointing a shaky finger to across the road. A haggard woman of indeterminate age was standing at the forest entrance giggling that awful, horrifying giggle, and was now waving over at us. We screamed and ran inside and looked out of my friend's bedroom window through the smaller scap the curtain, and could still see the woman standing there for some time. Worse yet, she was staring right at us, almost as if I don't know she knew that we were there. Somehow we could tell that she was still giggling, that hideous, appalling laugh, and then she just turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. Needless to say, we never went back to that forest, nor went out after dark ever again. So I'm going to start by saying that I'm basically a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, although I do love hearing stories and listening to others' points of views when it comes to that kind of stuff. This is why I'm having such a hard time. I think of understanding what happened to me last September. You see, my dad, grandma, grandpa, and I were attending my cousin's wedding in a small rural town just outside of South Haven, Michigan, late last summer. We rented a small house in town, which was located in a very wooded area just off of a small lake. Something felt extremely off. As soon as I got out of the car, at our rental property, though that's the best way that I can describe it too, something felt off, and I was just immediately uneasy. But being the skeptic that I am, I shrugged it off, and just chalked it up to being tired and anxious. I guess the night that we arrived, my dad and I were having a smoke outside and noticed how weird everything sounded. It was about 11:00 p.m. and there was nobody else around, but the trees were crackling incredibly loudly, and we were hearing strange animal noises too, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I guess just the type of animal noises that you would hear in rural Michigan, I guess, but they just sounded particularly strange to us for some reason. In any case, we said our good nights and we went to bed the next morning. My dad told me that he went outside for a smoke at about 2ish that morning and heard what sounded to him like somebody close by banging on metal siding or something. He said that it sounded like it was just next door, but didn't hear anything leading up to or preceding the loud banging, like footsteps or anything like that. We shrugged it off in the end, and we just laughed it off. It was the second night, though, was when I heard the thing that I still cannot stop thinking about 6 months later. It was about 11:00 p.m. to midnight, and I was having my last smoke of the night. My grandparents were already asleep and my dad had gotten into bed, but still awake, just watching TV. I was sitting on the stairs outside of my back to the house, looking straight out into the backyard, when I heard someone shout my name in a very abrupt manner, loud and quickly. It sounded like they were shouting toward me from the front of the house, like they were standing on the front porch shouting for me, knowing that I was at the back of the house, and it sounded just like my dad, but it couldn't have been him, because I didn't hear the front door open or close or anything. Being a skeptic, I reminded myself to stay calm, and I quickly walked back into the house. My dad was sound asleep, so there was no way that by the time that I got him, he could have gotten back into bed. I woke him up in any case, and I asked him if he was outside screaming my name. He looked confused and said of course not. I started to get really freaked out at that point. I tried to go to bed, but just couldn't get the scream out of my head. I was up all night trying to figure out what had happened. I was honestly contemplating leaving, getting a hotel room somewhere close by and returning in the morning. Miraculously, I must have fallen asleep sometime around 3 in the morning. We woke up in the next morning, and I was so ready to get the heck out of that town as soon as we left. The uneasy feeling that I had the entire weekend disappeared. When I returned to work the next day, I told my co-worker the weird experience that I had. Her face immediately dropped. She proceeded to inform me that this is apparently quite common in the Appalachian area regarding encrypted and other types of creatures. Apparently they try to get your attention by mimicking someone close to you, and when you look at them, they kidnap you or something along those lines. But I was in Michigan. I tried to look up information about the town that I was in, but I couldn't find anything remotely interesting or related. So I'm wondering, has anyone else had a similar experience to mine, and if you have, what was it? It was April of 2008. I was 20 and living in Denver for a year-long work contract with a non-profit in Baylor. My girlfriend, now wife, and my best friend Tim, drove to Colorado from our home state to visit me for my 21st birthday. The non-profit that I was working for housed their workers in dorm rooms, and drinking was not allowed on site, nor were visitors allowed to stay overnight. So I booked a hotel in downtown Denver for the weekend, where we could drink in honor of my 21st. The hotel was big, very nice, and in a safe central area of the city. So nice in fact that it was the same hotel that most of the politicians would later stay at during the DNC convention of '08 that took place in Denver later that summer. My wife and Tim, they arrived Saturday morning and we all met up at the hotel. The day was fantastic. We drank across the city most of the day. By about 1:00 a.m. we got back to the hotel. The room was typical with 2 queen beds. Bed number 1 was close to a big window looking out across the city. Bed number 2 was pushed against the wall with a door that opened to the bathroom. You couldn't see the door or entryway to our room unless you were at the foot of the bed of number 1, but we drank more and chatted in the room until about 4:00 a.m. My wife was laying at the head of the bed number 2, flipping through the TV. Tim and I were seated at the foot of bed number 1, staring out of the window as we talked. As we talked, I heard some movement and sound of the door opening. Without looking away from the window, I assumed that it was my wife getting up to use the bathroom. A few minutes passed by and I thought that I heard movement again, so I finally turned around to look. I saw my wife still lounging in bed number 2, as she had been. "Did you get up a few minutes ago and use the bathroom?" I asked her. "No," she replied. "I thought that I heard the door." I said back to her, with her just looking confused back at me. "Yeah, I thought that I heard that too," Tim said, breaking his own gaze from the window. It was then that I started to run cold and sobered up pretty quickly, very softly. I heard Tim say, "Hey, I think that there's someone in our room." I lurched forward from the foot of the bed to look into the pitch-black entryway. I could barely make it out and I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, but there was a man dressed in all black, with a black baseball cap pressed into the 90 corner of the entryway, where the room door and the wall met. Absolute silence fell on the room, and it felt like hours passed by. As I started to panic in my mind, I said, like, no way have I ever had anything like this in my entire life happened. We all knew that we weren't alone and hadn't been for a while as well, and he knew that we had spotted him. Eventually, Tim got the courage to meekly speak in the direction of the corner in the entryway and said, "Hey man, is there something that we can help you out with?" Another period of silence that felt like an eternity went by. He slumped off the edge of the wall a little into the light, and made eye contact with Tim and I. We all just stared at each other. Then eventually he spoke up and said, "Is this room 179? "No man, it's not," Tim said, stroking his beard nervously. He stared at us for a while longer, raising his eyebrows and shaking his head, and then he turned around and left. We then erupted into a million curse words and paced around the room. I called the front desk. They told me that he was drunk and that they found him in the stairwell, but directed him back to the right room. Minutes later, Tim called the front desk and they told him that he was not a guest. He was apprehended in the stairwell, apparently, and taken into police custody, and a while later, they told my wife that he had disappeared and they had no idea who he was or what he was doing. They told her that there wasn't even a room 1709 in the hotel. We got 3 different stories from the front desk is what I'm getting at, and we still have no idea what it was all about or how we managed to get a key card to our room. We were sure the door was closed. In fact, it was easily the most terrifying moment of my life, and always use the latch in the hotel rooms as my advice. We got the stay refunded and about $200 in credit for food from the hotel. We would have sued, but we were young and stupid, and to be honest, we just wanted to get out of there and forget about it. So I was kicked out of my mother's house at 18 and went to live with my uncle and father in Selma, Alabama. It was an old house that belonged to my grandmother before she passed. My folks used to tell me stories when I was younger about the house, saying that it was haunted or something and was once a slave house. Someone has a history of slavery, and even was once called Slave City. So I believe the stories. But there was even a rumor, though, that a witch lived in the house before my grandmother. It's also rumored that my grandmother's brother even dated a woman who was said to be a witch, and apparently she put candles around the doorsteps with a chicken with its head cut off in the middle or something. I've had family members tell me about their stories of seeing and hearing paranormal activity around the house, but at this point I had never witnessed anything myself, so I thought that they were all just superstitious and paranoid. Anyway, after a while, I moved into my father's old room, and he warns me that one day I'll start hearing voices. I had a dog at the time, and he even warned me that one day my dog would die. His exact words were a bit more cryptic than that, though, but I got the drift. He said they'll either kill you or the dog. I like thinking that it was just joking, to be honest. He told me that my aunt was secretly a witch, and that I couldn't trust my uncle. He also told me that if something starts calling for you to come outside the room at strange times, it's not real. I laughed at him even more then, because I remembered other family members saying that he was crazy and talked to himself sometimes. Despite his claims, everything seemed okay for a while, though. One day I was preparing to leave Selma for a job interview in Montgomery. My aunt saw me dressed up and asked where I was headed. I told my aunt, who was living there at the time too, that I was going to take a nap, and I was heading to Montgomery afterward for a job, an interview. Hours later I walked out of the house to find that my front tire was slashed. All of a sudden my aunt appeared out of nowhere and asked what happened, and this was a bit strange to me. She was acting unusual, but I didn't question her. Luckily I had a spare in the back of my Jeep. I fed my dog and left for Montgomery, and it was dark when I came back to Suma hours later. My uncle, though, said that my dog was dead and he didn't know what happened to it, and that they had already buried him too. I felt some type of way about my dog mysteriously dying, so I asked my aunt's kids, who were always outside playing, what happened, and one of the kids told me that they beat the dog and kicked it until it stopped moving. Now I have never heard this child talk like this, and he was really serious about it. Well, at least he seemed to be didn't blink or laugh while saying it. At this point I knew something was wrong with my folks, and my father randomly came over to the house the next day before I could say anything about the dog. He said, "I told you that they were going to kill it." He also said that he saw my uncle talking to some Mexicans who were known for doing voodoo. When he passed by late last night again, though, I just laughed it off, because my father was always a joker, but deep inside I was starting to get very worried. I have to admit. In any case, the next day as soon as I woke up, I had this weird, unrealistic feeling. Then I heard my father call my name from outside the house. He called me by my nickname that he used to call me as a kid when he first lived in my grandmother's house. I was about to go out too, when I remembered what he said. If something starts calling for you to come outside the room at strange times, it's not real. I paused for a few seconds, then swung the door open, but as he said, nobody was there. It was very early in the morning. My father was more than likely at work, and 2 days later I woke up at 3:00 in the morning, walked outside of the house, because I felt weird. As I walked around the outside of the house, I heard sounds like birds sweeping over my head. When I looked up, I saw nothing but black shadows flying everywhere. I looked to the sky and the moon was so close to the earth that it might, as well have been a giant eyeball staring right at me. A few days after that, the people from the job interview called back and said that I got the job I was supposed to start next week. Later that night, though, I felt a presence in the room with me as I tried to sleep. It felt negative, so I put my headphones in and played some positive music. But even with the music playing, the presence felt like it was getting stronger and stronger. Somehow too, my left earbud fell out of my ear, and it was then that I heard a dog or a wolf or something like that growling in the room. I could even feel the vibration of the growling. I instantly got up and left the house, and I didn't come back until the morning that night later in the week. I was preparing to leave the house so that I could live with my family and Montgomery for the job. I had gathered all of my things and was ready to go. I sat back on the bed to get a short rest before I hit the road, when all of a sudden it sounded like something was running up to the side of the bed, and something grabbed my hair and yanked it. The force literally almost pulled me off the side of the bed. It was then that I left in that moment, and after that I swore to myself that I would never be back, and I have never gone back since December 3rd, 2022. It was around 10 p.m. My daughter was asleep on the sofa. I took her up to bed. She was sleepwalking again, and she said, "Stop it, Dad." I said, "I haven't done anything, Kelly." I laughed and she then stopped in her tracks and then had this odd sort of bent forward posture, with her arms stretched down to her sides, with her fingers spread out, and said, "I'm not Kelly," but in a sort of old woman's voice, with a deliberate pause before she said her name. "Of course you're Kelly, silly," I replied and laughed. She then carried on walking half asleep to her bedroom. She got into her bed and closed her eyes. I kissed her on her head and I said, "Love you, Kelly." She started to fidget in her bed and with her eyes still closed, announced. I said, "I'm not Kelly," the same old woman's voice in a pause before her name, and also now a bit of irritation in her voice. Then I realized this wasn't my daughter mimicking someone, this may be somebody else. I got goosebumps up and down my arms and said, with a little stutter in my voice, "If you're not Kelly, then who are you?" My daughter then opened her eyes, lifted her head, and adjusted herself to be eye to eye with me, and started to stare intensely into mine with these matte black eyes with no color, then put herself back on her pillow, shut her eyes, and just instantly went back to sleep. I woke her up and it was like I'd awoken her from a deep slumber. I said, "Kelly, are you okay?" She says, "Yeah, Dad, why did you wake me?" I said, "Oh, nothing, just checking that you're okay," and then asked her to pray with me, which she did with no issues. Maybe a little bit of confusion. Then I kissed her on the head, said that I loved her, and I left her to go back to sleep. The next day, I had to drop a parcel to my neighbor's next door. The brother and the sister opened the door. I gave them their parcel and I asked how they were, because their mother had died in the summer, and I said, "Do you feel like your mom is about it all?" The daughter replied, "Oh yeah, they feel her presence a lot, and that they also had seen a ghost out on the fields in front of a house of a young girl, 6 years old, who had died on a playing area that used to be there." She then told me that she and her mother used to regularly use a Ouija board to contact the little girl, and had done this many times speaking to her, and the little girl had replied saying that she is protecting the area so other children don't get killed there. And also a friend of the family who had died and was still visiting them in spirit form, apparently dressed in a hood, and was seen moving through their rooms at night to check on them. I replied that I don't really mess with that stuff and I just said my goodbyes to them, but I left with a really sick feeling of myself stomach. 2 days later I was going to bed for an early shift at work. I went to bed at 11:00 p.m. and went straight to sleep when suddenly I awoke, but I had my eyes shut and in my head I heard myself say, "There's somebody in the room." I opened my eyes and in the dark I could see a man with white hair and black glasses working on a device pressing into it, where my wife's side of the bed is. I jumped back shocked and I started to get out of bed. I turned my head away just for a brief moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. It was a real person, though totally solid and real to look at. I wasn't scared at that time. I guess I was just completely bewildered. I laid back down after getting a drink of water and went back to sleep somehow, and then again it happens. I'm suddenly awake with my eyes closed, and once again my mind is telling me that somebody is in the room. I open my eyes, and this time it's more sinister, though to my right at the side of the bed where my wife sleeps, there's a creature with matte black eyes staring at me. In fact, the eyes reminded me of how my daughters looked a few days before. Whatever it was around 4 and 2 foot tall and seemed like a mixture of maybe a gargoyle and a gremlin, with no wings and long pointed ears that pointed straight up, nostrils like a gorilla's. Its skin was dark green and leathery, with light orangey sort of brown tips going down its arms. It was looking straight at me with a mouth that seemed to be frothing on one side, and it looked very old, exhausted, almost very hungry perhaps, and was slowly panting while looking in my direction. I slowly got out of bed, not taking my eyes off of it for a second, and slowly walked around the bed towards it and noticed that it had very long arms, with what looked like 5 clawed sort of fingers on each hand. The way that it was standing reminded me of the bent forward posture that my daughter had earlier in the week, with the arms hanging down to its sides. I also noticed when I was moving from the bed. Its gaze did not follow me. It seemed to be just looking to where I had been sleeping, and as I got a little closer, maybe 5 feet away, it then just disappeared from the room, like it just was here in reality, and then all of a sudden it was gone. Not like it faded, but more like it just blinked out of reality. Well, obviously I was scared now, and after that I didn't get any more sleep. The next 2 weeks were fine, but from late December 2022 into now February of 2023, I have started to have real trouble sleeping. I feel like I'm constantly being watched, but also I feel an icy cold wind blows on my neck, around my spine and knees. Sometimes my wife and the rest of my family are just fine me. I get really cold in areas of my body, around my neck and knees and face, especially between my eyes and nose. If I'm lucky, I'll have like 1 to 2 days of good sleep, and then a couple of days of bad sleep, maybe 2 hours sleep each day. I've seen a dog doctor, and I've had a urine and blood test, and they've all come back fine. I've been given sleeping tablets and I have been taking calming tablets. They do help, But it's still happening and I'm getting cold and sometimes feeling like I don't know something's here watching. I also saw a visor and had myself blessed, and also a crucifix and a holy Bible blessed as well. And when I went around the house saying the Lord's Prayer, and then telling it to leave by the power of God and Jesus, that seemed to help for one day, the house got very positive and light and I slept really well. But the next day I had terrible sleep again, and it was almost like back to square one. I really don't know what to do. It's really disturbing me for obvious reasons, but to other people it's probably just sounds like a bad horror film. I know that I don't know if I'm going crazy. I don't know if I'm actually seeing something. I don't know why my daughter said what she said during her sleepwalking, but it feels real to me, and there have been other small things starting to happen, which even my other family members have noticed too, which makes me believe that I'm not going crazy. Something is actually happening. I was about 8 or 9 and lived in a small town in Alabama where everyone knows everyone. We lived in a subdivision of duplexes. The front of the neighborhood had a small rent office with the tenants' mailboxes outside on the wall. My favorite task was going to get the mail. This particular day, my sister, 5 or 6 at the time, asked to go with me. Our duplex was right behind the office up at the top of the grassy hill. The backside of our home faced the office, so my sister and I would get to the mailbox, and as I'm removing the mail, a white middle-aged couple, relevant I'll explain, pulled up in front of the building, this being Alabama in the 80s. Our neighborhood was all black. The white people lived on the other side of the railroad tracks. I knew a lot of them, as most families were here for generations, but I'd never seen this couple. The woman on the passenger side rolled down her window and said, "Excuse me, can we ask you all a question? We need to see, yes," and I knew about stranger danger, so just plain to ignore them. My sister was starting to walk to the car window, though, as my back was partially turned, locking the mailbox. I ran and grabbed her hand and said, "Run to the house." She tried to ask why, as the woman continued calling us to the car. I raised my voice and said, "Get up the hill now." She started running up the hill. I turned to follow when the driver, a male, opened his door and in an angry voice said, "Get back here now." At this point, my sister was up the hill. I started running up the hill, and when I got to the top I saw that the driver was standing a few feet from the bottom of the hill. I started to laugh and said, "Ha ha, I beat you're too slow." I even stuck my tongue out. He turned and walked back to his car. My mother was not home. Don't remember where she was at, but I went into the house and stupidly never mentioned this incident until I was much older. I was around 15 or 16 when I remembered and understood the actual danger that I had been in that day. My mother was shaking when I finally told her I'm not going to say where, since I'm still in the area, but we're at a vacation in somewhere in Europe. Me and my sister-in-law were skating and were approached by this British lady asking how to get into the ice rink. I, having watched and read so many murder mystery documentaries and posts, immediately had a bit of a bad feeling, since the kiosk that you have to pay for renting shoes is facing the rink. I mean, you can't miss it. There were so many people there, but that couple came straight to us 3 vulnerable women. I ignored it and kept skating with my sister and sister-in-law. However, we were roped into a conversation with this woman. I came over to listen in, and all she was saying is how pretty they are, and urging them to take off their sunglasses so that she can get a better look at them, and asking their ages and where they worked. This just sort of confirmed to me too that something was up before I could say anything. She turned to me and went, "Oh my goodness, you look like a model. You should work for Chanel," and this definitely confirmed it even more to me that it just smelled like BS calling a 4-foot woman a model just to stroke her ego. Her husband then walks over to us right after, stares really creepily at me, offers a handshake and proceeds to call me a Kardashian. At this point I wanted to signal to my sisters to leave immediately, but the lady goes, "Oh my goodness, we should all take a picture." I shook my head, told my sisters in Arabic that they are bad news and we should leave. I left, but my sister was very gullible enough so to agree to take the picture. Moments later, I told my dad about what had happened and how creeped out I am by the whole situation, and how those two have my sister's pictures. My dad and I decided to walk over to them to have them delete the pictures. As we approached them, I could see that the guy that took the pictures had the photos selected and seemed to be in the middle of sending them to a WhatsApp group chat, which obviously made my heart drop to my stomach after hearing about some trafficking stories. If you can't get enough of these bone-chilling stories, don't forget to subscribe for more.